Hello, my name is Gabby, and I'm here to present a panel on a few different tabletop role-playing games that I would like to encourage you to try instead of Dungeons & Dragons. So, D&D is kind of considered the bread and butter of tabletop role-playing. It's considered kind of, the default. It's this giant juggernaut that kind of takes up most of the space. When you talk to someone about role-playing, they think Dungeons & Dragons. When you say, hey, do you want to sit around the table and you want to make up a story with me and your other friends, they'll think, yeah, like Dungeons & Dragons, right? And I've had some great times playing Dungeons & Dragons. But the truth is that Dungeons & Dragons only gives you the tools to tell a very specific kind of story. Most of the rulebook is combat rules, and it is basically entirely designed around being powerful heroes who fight a lot in a fantasy world. And so if you want to tell any other kind of story, there's a lot of other good games out there. And something I see a lot, if you're like me, and you're a sad little goblin and you spend a lot of your time on Reddit, you might see people saying, oh, I want to run a grittier game of Dungeons & Dragons. What rules can I change? I want to run a science fiction game of Dungeons & Dragons. How can I do that? And there are lots of extremely ambitious, extremely creative, extremely well-written, homebrew modules and alternate rules that let you try and play all of these different, vastly different turns and stories in Dungeons and Dragons. But I think it's a shame that people jump to that, and they don't ask, what else could I play that would give me that? So I'm just going to talk to you about some of my favourite tabletop games, what they offer to you that Dungeons and Dragons can't, and why maybe you should try them. So, if you do like combat, and a lot of people do like the combat of Dungeons & Dragons, there's some really good, well-designed tactical combat games out there that have really, I think, iterated on Dungeons & Dragons, especially some based off Dungeons & Dragons 4th edition, which had more complicated tactical combat. Not everyone liked it, but some people did. And some of those people made Lancer, which is a tabletop role-playing game about mech pilots, like from Gundam or Pacific Rim, flying around space and doing battle in giant robots. And something that I really like about Lancer, that I think makes it very easy to have very exciting strategic battles in Lancer, is that instead of just giving you stat blocks, Lancer divides all of its NPC mechs that the GM controls and sets against the players, into classes, and says these are assault mechs. They are best played to try and do damage and to charge the players and hurt them in close range. These are supportive mechs. These ones will try and defend their teammates. And so what that leads to is, instead of D&D, which basically gives you no guidance on how to play an encounter, other than, you use challenge rating, you build an encounter, say, okay, well, a fair encounter for this party is 20 goblins and a young red dragon. But after that, you're not given any guidance by the game on how to actually run that fight, or, what victory even means in that fight. While Lancer comes with a list of several ways to run combat with different objectives, with different victory conditions, and it provides extensive guidance strategically on how to play the enemy. And that means that Lancer combat often it's very fun, it can be very tense, it can feel very heroic as well. So it kind of does a lot of what D&D does, but I think is just much better designed and more tightly designed as a tactical combat system. And also has deeper customization, because with each level up, the players get to choose new weapons and new systems for their mech. So as you go on, you kind of develop into a very unique mech that really feels yours, that you can fill with all kinds of ridiculous mechanical synergies. And so you get that really great feel that you can get in D&D from, say, finding a completely broken multi-class. But in Lancer, it's kind of actually designed to give you those ridiculous interactions. And so it's kind of encouraging you to take those, rather than feeling a bit like you're breaking the game. So Lancer is fantastic for that. If what you like about D&D is the fantasy, you just love, say, The Hobbit, you know. You love The Hobbit? Why would I say The Hobbit? I meant the good ones, The Lord of the Rings. If you like The Hobbit, get out. They're not very good movies. They're quite bad. Sorry to any Hobbit fans in the audience. But be honest with yourselves, I think you just like Martin Freeman. Because they were quite bad movies. But if you like heroic fantasy, then Dungeon World is a game that is designed basically explicitly to be an alternative to Dungeons & Dragons. And it uses Powered by the Apocalypse, which is a framework used by many different RPGs, which means that they're based off, mechanically, a game called Apocalypse World. And what it means to be powered by the apocalypse is that they adopt a similar philosophy, which is the idea of every single roll matters. So I think we can all agree, one of the absolute worst feelings in Dungeons & Dragons is, say, when you're a spellcaster and you take your turn and you cast a spell and the enemy make their saving throw, and that's it. Nothing happened. You might as well just not have done anything. You've wasted, 10, 15, 20 minutes of your time on that turn, basically, because it didn't amount to anything. And the idea behind Powered by the Apocalypse is that every single roll should move the story forward. So you might succeed, you might get a hit, you might get a partial hit, or you might miss, which is, the equivalent of failure. But instead of simply nothing happens, when that happens, the GM gets to make a hard move, which are a list of various events that can happen in the story. And what that does is because in Dungeons & Dragons, the GM side, the DM side of the table is barely even a game in terms of you're not really given any rules for what you can do. You're basically said, here's kind of all the player stuff. You make something up. Just make some stuff happen. Good luck. And this leads a lot of people to think, man, being a DM is so hard. Running games is so hard. I just want to be a player forever. Which leaves a lot of very poor, very sad, very overworked people like me as forever DMs. And say something nice to your GM. Go after this panel, go find your GM and give them just a few words of appreciation. Because trust me, those people need it. But by giving you moves, so move, for example, in a Powered by the Apocalypse game, will inform the kind of story that ends up getting told. So in Monster of the Week, which is a Powered by the Apocalypse game, which is, as it says, it's a Monster of the Week game, so taking after shows like Buffy or The X-Files, one of the GM's moves is to separate the players. And so that leads to a lot of, we got split up from our crew. And, that lets you recreate, naturally, the tropes of that kind of game. And it never feels unfair, because it's right there in the rulebook. It says, right, this is a specific thing the GM has access to. And so Dungeon World is based on that system where every roll matters. What the GM can do is kind of laid out on the table. It's not restrictive because these are very open-ended moves that let you do a lot with very little. But it's still set in this kind of classic Dungeons & Dragons-esque fantasy world with elves and dwarves and magic and gods. And but what it really shines above D&D for terms of having heroic adventures is that it dedicates a lot more of the rulebook and a lot more of the moves that players can do to non-combat situations. So it lets you face different challenges, like, environmental hazards, or uncooperative kings, or so on, with nearly as much mechanical weight and nearly as much mechanical engagement as the combat. Whereas in Dungeons & Dragons, these things, basically, it's up to the GM to come up with something. Otherwise, as what the rulebook says, it's just, this is a skill check. Make it, or nothing will happen. Nothing. No, the story doesn't move on, and nothing happens. And if you're looking for something gritty, Dungeons & Dragons is very bad, very, very bad at gritty. Because it is designed for extremely high-powered, heroic people. That is what the game seems you want to be playing as. That is what all the class abilities are geared towards. And that is how the entire death saving throws work. You know, death saving throws are kind of the antithesis of anything gritty, because anyone who has played Dungeons & Dragons for a long time will know that the best use of healing words or cure wounds is as soon as someone goes down, just woof, pop them back up. And they might get, you know, kind of hit back down again, which turns difficult fights, usually, into a large-scale game of adventure whack-a-mole, where you've got people getting up and then getting knocked back down left and right. So Dungeons & Dragons, it doesn't really do gritty, because the players are just always going to be very powerful. They're going to have a lot of options available to them, and because the GM doesn't have any rules, there's no structure to the way the GM can run the world, when you're very harsh, when you're very brutal to the players in Dungeons & Dragons, it feels unfair, because you are basically just making stuff up, completely whole cloth with nothing to guide you. And the feeling of that from the player side is that if something horrible happens, the GM has just said, think, man, I'm going to make a bad thing happen. As opposed to a game that gives you the tools you need to say, you know, this is something you can do, this is something that's on the table. So Shadow of the Demon Lord is another game, which I think is fantastic for capturing that gritty feel which Dungeons & Dragons isn't good at. It's a game that has the kind of feel of Bloodborne or Dark Souls, where you're playing people in a dangerous and cruel and dark world, full of monsters and destruction, and combat can be very deadly. It can be very, very brutal, and again, there's large, interesting systems for a lot of things. It does classes in a very interesting way, where there's 4 classes for the first 4 levels, and then you can choose a second class at your 4th level, and then at your 10th level you choose a 3rd class. And so you start out with 4 classes of choice, then it goes to 64, and then it goes into, I guess it's 16, and then it goes to 64. So essentially what it does is, instead of locking you into something from the beginning and saying, well, I'm a ranger, so I want to get, you know, level 18 ranger ability, so I'm going to be a level 1 ranger, you get to make your choices as you go along and build on what you've already done and decided. And that's something I really like in a game. I like the ability, I think it does character progression in a much more natural and a much more, you know, personal way than Dungeons & Dragons, where you really get to make these choices as you go along. And a lot of people don't really like Dungeons & Dragons for the combat. I think these are the people I want to kind of reach out to most. If you ever say things like, oh, well, you know, in our game, we don't fight as many monsters as we befriend them, or we like to recruit the monsters, or we like to trick the monsters into their own defeat, we like to set traps, we are a party that like to indulge in ridiculous get-rich-quick schemes. All those kind of things are just things that aren't really provided for by Dungeons & Dragons. And doing them in Dungeons & Dragons basically means that the GM is working overtime to make that stuff up, to just provide you with a way to interact with these things in a way that feels satisfying and relevant, because the game isn't doing anything to help them. Because Dungeons & Dragons, if you just look at the rules, is, by me, it's 80% combat. Dungeons & Dragons is very, very clear. It doesn't market itself this way, which I think is quite dishonest. But if you read the rules cover to cover, you will see very clearly it is a game about combat. That's what the game is about. And so if your table isn't about combat, Dungeons & Dragons probably just is not the right game to be playing. Which is why I think it's a shame that it's the default game. That a lot of people say, well, tabletop role-playing, that means Dungeons & Dragons. So here are some games that you can have adventures in, but that aren't about fighting. Some of them might have combat in them, but they're not about that. So Ryutama is a Japanese role-playing game. It takes after JRPG, so if you've played Final Fantasy VII, or Bravely Default, or that's all the JRPGs I know. I don't play them. But it takes after those in tone and aesthetic. And it's a game about... It's quite delightful. It's a game about traveling and exploring. And it has mechanics for things like the weather, for getting tired as you explore, for discovering new places. And the GM can send a dragon to guide you, which is a very delightful... so the GM picks a character as well, and each one has a special ability which lets you tweak the story in the favor of the players once per session in a different way, which is very fun, because one of I think the best things about Dungeons and Dragons about running is that I think GMing shouldn't be this adversarial thing. I think you're basically there to make sure everyone has fun, right? So you should be encouraging everyone, and you should be supporting them. And that's what Utama lets you do. It's just a very, very simple game about classic adventurers, but instead of always fighting, you might be exploring, or you might be picking rare herbs to make potions, or you might be selling traveling wares. And yeah, it's a very sweet game. Another sweet game about traveling is Wander Home, which is a very recent release. I've played it quite recently, and it's a game about tiny animal people traveling a Ghibli-esque world. Kind of Beatrix Potter illustration style animal people. So, in conclusion, I guess what I'd like to say to everybody is, before you start a game of Dungeons and Dragons, think to yourself, what kind of story do I want to tell with my friends? And is it this one? Is it one about a bunch of, heroic fantasy, very powerful characters who go around, fighting everything as their main resolution for solving problems? And if that's not the kind of story you want to tell, if you want to tell a story in a different kind of world, or a different kind of story, or focus on something else, just try a different system. I'm not saying you should never play Dungeons and Dragons, but think about what it's good at, and think about what it's not. And if you're trying to do something it's not good at, the answer isn't to force Dungeons and Dragons to fit into a hole that it doesn't fit into. But it might be just to try something else, go find an indie game, and there'll be something, whatever you want to run, no matter how ridiculous the premise or how niche the reference material that you want to use, you'll find something. I guarantee it, as long as you look. Thank you, that's been my panel.